The following is rated not safe for work. It contains strong language, adult situations, and lots of spoilers. Discretion is advised.
In the criminal justice system, cinematic-based offenses are considered especially heinous. The dedicated attorneys who investigate these villainous films are members of an elite squad known as the Reels of Justice. These are their stories.
Order, please, order. The Reels of Justice is now in session. Judge Big Ben Haslar presiding. Your eyes for the Honorable Judge Haslar. Be seated. Bienvenidos a la Caretes de la Justicia. Today we are hearing the case of the people versus Harry and the Hendersons, a 1987 family comedy about a run-of-the-mill household that befriends a run-of-the-mill Sasquatch that they hit with their station wagon. For those of you unfamiliar with our court proceedings, we are here to determine if this film is guilty of being a bad movie. As always in this courtroom, films are considered excellent until proven awful, and the burden of proof lies upon the prosecution to prove beyond a shadow of reasonable doubt that this film is guilty. Mr. Dylan J. Schlender, you are representing the prosecution. You may present your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. Members of the jury, today we are here to expose Harry and the Hendersons for what it truly is. A meandering, overlong, overly sentimental mess that thinks a big rubber suit is enough to justify its existence. Well, newsflash, it is not. This film is guilty of a few things, but let's focus on the big three. It rests entirely on the technical achievement, which offers no substance. It drags the audience through a lethargic and unfocused story, and of course, it manipulates them with schmaltz instead of giving us a story with a real emotional impact.
Thank you, Mr. Schlender. Appearing on behalf of the defense is Mr. Pruitt. You may present your opening statement.
Well, after rewatching the film, it's going to be a difficult one to defend, but I'll do my best. And I'll do it from the standpoint of, I think that this is a classic piece of American cinema, hyper cerebral. There's only like The Shining, Mulholland Drive, Inception, Harry and the Hendersons. And I think what this is at its heart, it's an archetypal hero's journey. If you see this through a Jungian lens, then I would like to make the argument that George goes through a hero's journey after a difficult encounter and integration with the unconscious itself as represented by Harry, the Sasquatch. So I don't know how in-depth I can get at this point, but I could give you an archetypal synopsis.
I'd save that for your exhibit.
Yeah, save it for your first exhibit. Very well said. Mr. Schlender, you may present your first exhibit.
Thank you, Your Honor. If I may talk about the Sasquatch in the room, Maynard Bangs. No, I'm kidding.
Hey,
let's talk about.
Shaved.
Let's talk about Rick Baker's Bigfoot suit, which admittedly is pretty impressive. Every once in a while, you can, quote unquote, see the seams. You can see the actor's mouth through the Bigfoot's mouth every once in a while. But I mean, nothing so glaring. It's a fine piece of craftsmanship. I mean, when they make this, they didn't.
On the prosecution.
Well, I'm getting to it.
Okay.
You know how I like building things up to tear them down, Your Honor.
You like seeing that look in our face as we like
mostly, yes. So, because let's be honest, like they didn't know what Blu-rays were going to be, that we would be pausing it. They didn't even know what cinematic courts or podcasts were. So Rick Baker didn't put himself in this position on purpose. So if we want to acknowledge the achievement in creature design, we can. But is this enough to get the movie out of bad? And I say it is not. Because the film mistakes technical execution for storytelling. It assumes that if Harry looks good, the audience won't notice how little is actually happening. A great creature film uses its monster as a vehicle for a theme. There could be tension, some kind of emotional weight. Let's think about one of our favorites, King Kong from 1933. The beast represents this primal terror and this tragic, 'twas beauty killed the beast, yucca, yucca, yucca. Another famous monster, E.T. He's a metaphor for wonder and also represents loss and maybe a bit of Jesus stuff too. He does come back from the dead. But what does Harry from Harry and the Hendersons do? I mean, it's slapstick. And like he eats breakfast and he watches TV. It treats Harry as a prop rather than a meaningful character. It lets him bumble around smashing things and mug for the camera instead of contributing to anything remotely compelling. The best practical effects should be in service of a story, not a substitute for it, or otherwise it's just an expensive puppet show.
All right, Mr. Pruitt, would you like to take a guess at to what Harry might symbolize, or maybe tack on to how good the suit is?
Well, I think if the jury would hear me out here, I can hear Dylan's point about seeing only the surface level suit, but I think for those that have eyes to see, there's a very deep, archetypal, mythologically rich story at play here. So if we want to start with what Harry represents, or if we want to start with the protagonist, George, I'm happy either way, whatever you prefer.
Oh, your choice. Let's start with maybe the Sasquatch, because that's what he started with.
Well, I think that the suit isn't exactly, it doesn't quite comport with what claimants describe. If you were to aggregate in general the credible or reliable claims of people who claim to have observed a Sasquatch, the suit doesn't quite look like that. But it is a sort of a unique contribution in that it's, to your point, a much more technically advanced depiction of a Sasquatch than anything that had been seen on screen, especially big screens prior to that. You had small screen like schlockumentaries, suits in search of and things of that nature. And then you had a couple of larger screen films, The Legend of Boggy Creek, which everyone always, reverts back to whenever they're talking about Sasquatch on film, or even some like theatrical documentaries, Mysterious Monsters, etc. But this suit is definitely a technical achievement. And Rick Baker, if I'm not mistaken, I think Baker was also responsible for the Michael Jackson Thriller video, which is another huge achievement. So you got to hand it to Baker.
Yes,
there.
he was.
So but I do think that at its core, this is a story about ego consciousness encountering the collective unconscious and the transformative effect of this encounter on all parties involved. But
I would like to hear more about this.
So, in the beginning, we meet George, and George is like seemingly this everyman, right? He sort of vacillates between aggression and benevolence from time to time, which is, I would say like an all too common symptom of modern man's spiritual malaise. And so that's how George is presented to us. And, we later learn through the story that, in fact, he's an artist. He's someone that wanted to pursue art, but was basically struggling against the tyrannical father who's imprisoned him to this mediocre life of outdoor retail and hunting and selling ammo and things of that nature. But because he's an artist, we could assume that like he sees the beauty in the world in a way that the common man, maybe such as Dylan, can't see at the surface.
Yes.
And so, struggling against this tyrannical father, he's sort of starting to pass that down because in the beginning of the film, he's taking his family on this hunting trip and he's trying to like teach his son to be a hunter like his father taught him to be. But then he has this encounter, with something straight out of the unknown, something wild and primal, which I do think is a representation of the darker parts of the unconscious, the parts that we don't reach into, but that are reminiscent of us, ourselves. And so thus begins his journey towards self-actualization after encountering this portion of the unconscious. And I do think that there are these various archetypal characters, wink, wink, being sort of represented. Like, for example, Dr. Wrightwood, which historically speaking is kind of an amalgam of a Canadian journalist named John Green, who was one of the first people to really investigate the Sasquatch phenomenon seriously in the 1950s and early 1960s. And also the first academic to pursue it, a guy named Dr. Grover Krantz at Washington State University. But I see Wrightwood in this film as sort of the representation of the archetype of like the wise old man. He's this storehouse of hidden wisdom. He's been on this relentless pursuit for years at great personal cost. But due to his fruitless search thus far, he's kind of become cynical and stultified. And so he has this roadside museum, which is basically like he lives in a cemetery with all the relics of his dead dreams. And then you have on the opposite side, this guy, Jacques Lafleur, the dogged Sasquatch hunter, which is, historically speaking, kind of meant to be based on a guy named René de Hinden, who was a real Sasquatch researcher, a Swiss-born guy who immigrated to Canada in his youth and was also a very sort of like cynical, dark character, almost had a trickster element, René. And so you see that reflected in Lafleur. But I think the Lafleur character sort of represents the shadow. Maybe to some degree, George's shadow, because when George first encounters the Sasquatch, he tries to bring it into his world. He wants to tame it, and he makes it explicit to his family that what he really wants to do with it is use it for personal gain and monetary benefit. He starts saying like, oh, we can get this on television. We can get it. It'll be good for us. It'll be good for Harry. It'll be good for everyone. So he sort of feigns having altruistic motivations when clearly it's selfish. Whereas Lafleur is like very explicitly out for gain and glory and fame. He wants to kill one for that reason.
Well, there's your meaning, Mr. Schlender. Were you so focused on Harry you didn't see the forest for the trees there?
I will admit that my learned opponent is maybe reading a bit too deep into this, but it is interesting.
You think?
It is interesting. No, but this is actually the kind of argument I like, because I do think it's interesting. And so let's look at George. We'll take what you said about him and about how this could be conceivably viewed as some kind of journey he's going on from everyman to some kind of transformed or transcendent man through his encounter with Harry. The only problem is this all happens in the course of 4 days. We don't see any real reason for Harry to be the impetus of this change. He's already a struggling artist. He already has these desires in him. Harry doesn't actually bring anything to the table except what you were talking about, where he has this glimmering moment of, oh, we can make money off this. We can do something with this. But then he begins to view Harry as a bit of a pet, right? And this is really fun. The film has a fundamental misunderstanding between the relationship between man and nature. And one of the things that really hurts this understanding is the constant amount of slapstick and stretching out the bits, right? So we don't actually get any of this exploration. We don't actually get any reason for there to be any of these changes that you're talking about. Like, it is literally, just like, so the movie can happen. You were talking about the professor being a font of old wisdom, and he said, I know a place we could drop him off, but we can't get there at night. It was a road. They drove up a road and just dropped him off. It was not... it was not any place.
Was at the end of the road.
Yeah, it was not to any place.
It was a long road.
It was a long road, but their cars have lights. They
don't want to go down that road.
They could have made it. So when we see this family, right, they're dragging this massive, untamed creature into their house. They don't know if he's dangerous or not, right? But obviously we're along for it because it's a comedy, and basically Harry is just like a sitcom guest. I mean, this is basically just a movie version of Alf, only it's just not as clever, right? And so when it finally decides that yes, we need to bring Harry back, they don't play this up as, oh, this was like this was necessary, this was the right thing to do, because the family's upset and we're supposed to be upset with the family. And it's like, no, we're not supposed to be upset. Harry's back where he belongs. This is where he should be. It was dangerous for him to be amongst the humans. There was no reason for him to be amongst the humans, and to try to make this a tearjerker ending, it just doesn't work. So I do appreciate where you're coming from with how maybe you could explore what George's character was going through, but the actual actions and moments we see on the screen don't lend itself to that kind of analysis.
I completely disagree. I would say that George's encounter with Harry, which is a metaphor for the ego's encounter with the unconscious, transforms him in the following ways. So he first attempts tame it, to, like, as Carl Jung would say, to improperly annex it to his personal consciousness, when it's something much older and deeper and more eternal than that. And so that is the impetus to begin the hero's journey. So what happens since then? Well, first of all, he does manage to free himself from the rule of his tyrannical father. If you remember, he quits his job after his father rejects his artistic rendering of the Sasquatch that he wants to hang up in the hunting shop. He brings harmony to his previously, like, fractured household by uniting them all under this, like, single noble quest to return Harry to the wild where he belongs. He rescues the wise old man. He rescues Wrightwood. He kind of saves him from the abyss of cynicism and resentment that he's been dwelling in for all these years. He inspires LaFleur at the end to rise above his sort of selfish desires, which is sort of like a Jungian metaphor for the integration of the shadow. Like, LaFleur sheds that part of himself and decides that no, it is best to let these things live in the wild. And so ultimately, he does contend with the unconscious. He tries to allow it into his world, and then he properly places it back into the natural environment, the vast unknown where it belongs. And as a consequence, he's forever changed. Harry, the unconscious, is forever changed. And since you invoked a religious reference earlier talking about Jesus, I would say that this is akin to what Jung wrote about in The Answer to Job, about the encounter between Job and Yahweh and how both were forever changed. And then you see George's family happily united with LaFleur and Wrightwood, and you see the Sasquatch family walking off. And so I would say that as a consequence of this encounter, their generations each must surely flourish as a result. So there is a deeper metaphor to Harry and the Hendersons, at least as hard as I can dig, because, yeah, rewatching it, I was like, this is kind of a, well,
careful.
Don't say it.
No, stick with masterpiece.
This
Stick with
is an-
masterpiece of Jungian architecture. I like where you're going there.
this
I
was
feel
an
like I need to take a class to understand this case.
this was an amazing piece of American cinema, and apparently there was a television series after this. And so, for those of us who are dying to know how the rest of the story goes, hopefully that stuff's available for streaming somewhere.
It's not on trial, though. Mr. Schlender, you may present your third exhibit.
Very good. So I do appreciate some of these philosophical points, just to kind of put a button on it, though, is Harry's actions are not comporting to how this deeper subconscious would be acting as it relates to George's character, though. So if this is supposed to be a reflection of George, we wouldn't see, like, Harry wouldn't be acting like this, right? We would see Harry probably being more outwardly aggressive. We would see him, like, he just wouldn't be sitting down bumbling around watching TV. He would be doing something more dynamic that would force George to have that kind of reflection. And Harry never gives him that moment that makes him reflect. The closest thing would be like when he's looking at him through the scope and he sees his human eyes. And I've read in some Bigfoot literature, a lot of hunters who've claimed to have Sasquatches that in their sights don't shoot because of that human-esque quality. So it's not a philosophical thing. It's a very human desire to not shoot other humans. Anyway, my point being, I guess I can move on to my next point then.
I might.
So let's look at the story. Let's look at the four walls of the movie, what we're actually seeing, right? Movie's almost 2 hours, and the premise is stretched so thin and well beyond the breaking point, because you have to look, like, really, where is the core conflict here, right? The Hendersons hit Harry with their car. They take him home. They begin to realize that it wasn't a good idea, and then they basically wait for the movie to end. There's not a lot of momentum. There's not a lot of tension, and there's not really a sense of urgency. And this running around in the city where John Lithgow is just, like, shouting his Bigfoot yell, it's like, what are we doing here, And then he just meets up with him anyway. It's like, what the heck? So, like, what is this? It's not an adventure film. It's not a survival film. And I contest the comedic value of it, because it drags out every gag, and every gag happens at least twice. Again, to reiterate, we constantly see Harry bumbling around, knocking things over, eating food that's not food. I mean, like, how funny is that, right? I mean, if this was a half-hour TV show, and it's like the Hendersons meet Bigfoot, on this episode. That makes sense. Harry feels like a guest star in a middle of the road sitcom.
I wouldn't say that Harry as a representation of the unconscious would be necessarily relegated to George's personal unconscious, because
But that is what you said.
No, it's not. As Jung posited it in the way that I'm using it, is that underneath the ego consciousness is the unconscious, a portion of which is personal, meaning the experiences, the memories, etc., the observations that one has accrued in their lifetime. Underneath that would be a much larger portion, which Jung referred to as the collective unconscious, which is essentially an inherited layer. So you could think about that as like an operating system, in that if you have devices of a certain make, they all have the same operating system. Now, you might download different apps to use on these different devices, but at their core, there's a singular system which is copied and is, the baseline, the basal unit of every single item in that production. And so the collective unconscious are sort of seen as like the repository of the structure of the psyche that's common to all humans of the species, in the same way that, your DNA has code that builds a common skeletal structure and muscular structure and a nervous system, respiratory system, circulatory system, etc. The Jung posited that there was a portion of the psyche that was also collective, that each person inherited basically like a copy of this operating system. And the things that were common across all peoples, regardless of time and place or heredity or relationship, would be what he would refer to as archetypes, which are seen in like recurring themes and motifs in myths, cosmogonic origin stories, religious narratives, et cetera, fables, oral traditions, on and on and on. And so something of the nature of like the wild man archetype, which is what, many people have posited that the Sasquatch is a manifestation of, would be something more like that. And so, of course, he's bumbling around. Harry's a stranger in a strange land. He comes from the vast unknown, chaos itself, and is brought into, man's order, i.e. the purview of the ego consciousness, in my Jungian metaphor here, because I'm really trying to save this film. And
but here's the thing, though. It really starts falling apart, though, because they make the mistake of trying to make Harry seem more than an animal. Your theory only works if Harry's an animal, but we see him demonstrate too much empathy. He cares about other animals. He starts caring about other people. It's the humanity that they're seeing in him, which, again, this is already pretty attenuated to begin with. But if we're going to talk about like the ego and the collective subconscious and being a wild man, well, that's just not going to fly, because he's demonstrating a level of sophistication, a level of care. I mean, he even begins to learn the language at the end. He says okay and says a few other words here. So it really does not hold water because of what limited actions they do give Harry, i.e. the bumbling around that, and then showing the empathy for other humans, understanding loss, things that would not be present in your theory.
Is it your position that empathy is restricted to human beings?
The type of empathy that Harry was showing,
but you're not seeing empathy.
Yes,
you're seeing behavior and you're inferring empathy. And so I would say, if you study animal behavior pretty deeply, especially animals that live in any sort of social units, it is true for some solitary animals too, like orangutans would be a great example of one of the living great apes that's a solitary animal. They're conserved across primate species is like a generalized reciprocity, especially for like conspecifics, those of your sort or near your sort. But even if we wanted to remove that from primates, you could look at the behaviors of animals like wolves, for example, that, wolves live in particular hierarchies and there's a pecking order, and they will essentially vie for dominance or for position in these hierarchies through almost like a faux violence, but they don't actually hurt each other. Now, is it that they play by some rules or some ethics? Well, not really. I mean, I think that would be to anthropomorphize the wolves, to think that, they're behaving out of empathy or sympathy, versus like, no, this is just behavior that's been selected for across, untold generations. And so we observe the behavior and we interpret that as empathy. And so I think if you were to look at something like another great ape, something very man-like, well, the border gets blurred a little bit more, that boundary between man and animal, whereas, humans are animals. And so we share behaviors with the great apes, and we share a lot of physical form too. So it's easy to, attribute to other apes human emotions, like empathy, like you're doing here. But I don't necessarily think that's the case, but I do think you could also argue that there's something like a proto-morality or a proto-empathy among many animal species that could reasonably be inferred from observing behavior.
Well, here's the thing that makes this interesting, to continue off of what you were saying, because this is just such a common problem in media, seeking to elevate animals almost to man and seeking to denigrate man almost to animal. What we see with Harry, though, is none of the stuff you were just talking about. We saw him mourning stuffed deer, a mink. We saw him regretting that he ate something valuable to the daughter and bringing her more flowers. So we are seeing what could only be described as human empathy in a way we don't see in other animals. Everything you were talking about is like to like, right? Wolf to wolf. I mean, elephants mourn their dead too. They don't mourn people. You know what I mean? Like, so
they actually do.
They do not mourn people. I am
yes,
smart. And they do. So
I saw a video.
Yeah, the dog was at a guy's gravestone. I saw it too.
Yeah, you could train them to do that, but that's not what happened with Harry. Harry came in with all this stuff already. So like you can't just pull an animal out of the wild and exhibit the kind of empathy that Harry was feeling, because the idea was to try to elevate this beast to some kind of man, right? Which then, if we're doing that, it does cut against your other philosophical points where he was supposed to be something baser.
Are you well read in ethological literature?
I am.
because many of these things are very present. Many of these things are very present in, across mammalia. The animal kingdom will restrict it to mammalia because obviously we are mammals and we are animals. So I don't necessarily think that you could just relegate certain things to humankind and say that anything that remotely resembles that in film or as a reflection of that has no basis in the real world, because there's plenty of things that animals do that, again, are shared behaviors. Life has a common origin, and evolutionary biology shows us that, especially now that we have the advent of genetics. And so it's one of the things I always have to battle against when having discussions about the Sasquatch phenomenon or the hypothetical biological Sasquatch, is this dividing line between humans and apes or humans and other animals. Whereas it's like, man, we're not ape-like, or chimpanzees are not human-like. Like, we are very closely related. And so we share features and we share behaviors because we share genetics. And we also share genetics with rats and dogs and bananas. Not that we share behaviors with bananas, but there is a sort of like a common platform to varying degrees of homology across all of these different things.
I am high in potassium.
But if we look at, but now, okay, so let's pull it back a bit into the context of the movie, though. If we're looking at the intentionality of what the director, the actors, the writers were trying to do, it was obviously to try to humanize Harry. They weren't pointing out, oh, well, since we are genetically so close and there's inherently shared behaviors.
You don't know that. You don't know that.
No, like that's this movie that involves him watching The Addams Family. You think that's what they were going for? I'm pretty sure that that's not reasonable doubt. That's just like hogwash. Come on.
Did you have any other exhibits, Mr. Schlender, before you rest?
Yeah, no. So basically, I just want to put thank you. I'll just put a button on how schmaltzy and emotionally manipulative this is, right? Because it couldn't just be a lighthearted creature like, oh, look at the trouble Sasquatch getting into. No, it wants to try to make you cry at the end. It wants you to, and by doing that, it will say, oh, well, now it's deep, right? Because they got to get rid of Harry. They'll never see him again. He's back in the wild. And there's the soaring music. I mean, we even get Joe Crocker singing at the end, for crying out loud. But why? They've known Harry for maybe 3 days, and he was missing for a big chunk of that. And you get this full-blown melodramatic scene where it's like, we're gonna miss you, Harry, and like they're touching each other's faces, and the reason this is bad is because the film never actually earns that moment. It could have been pretty easy, and again, it's already far-fetched. It could have been pretty easy to have Harry build a better relationship with the Hendersons. He could have been there a week. They could have rehabilitated him from his injuries. I mean, there's lots of ways you can actually make this an emotionally impactful moment. But basically what this is just like, yeah, we're letting him back into the wild. This is the right thing to do, you know? So if you compare this again to something like to E.T., another kids movie, another creature feature, the goodbye there is heartbreaking because we've been able to watch the bond form. We know what E.T. really means to Elliot, right? The Hendersons are just upset because they can't keep a Bigfoot as a pet. I'm sorry, it's cheap. It's an artificial emotional play, and it's the worst kind of cheap emotional play at that. Though I do think it was pretty funny when he says, well, there's still Loch Ness. And I will end there and rest.
Yes, he died a while ago, I'm pretty sure.
It's a giant eel.
See, I'm cryptozoologically monogamous.
Smart man.
Like LaFleur can go do whatever he wants with Loch Ness. I'm not interested.
Well, I've got a lot of Dogman questions for you later, though. So
I've checked that at that. I would say from a personal level, like my only real defense, if I drop the pretense, would be like having seen every single bad Sasquatch movie, because they are all on free streamers like Tubi or
yes, they
or even
are,
like
man.
paid services like Amazon Prime Video, etc. Like they all follow the same format where there's this like terrible monster killer that you never really see because the suit's really bad. So it's always in the shadow and dismembering people, and some of that can be like great fun and like easily forgettable plots. And I think when people think about Sasquatch cinema, everyone goes to The Legend of Boggy Creek. I mean, I've been interviewing witnesses for 20 years and just networking with people who were either interested in the subject because they reached out to me to ask questions, or doing conferences, or, any of that public speaking stuff. And whenever I would ask people, just the general public, like, well, what got you interested in this subject? I would say like well over 70% of them say, oh, I saw The Legend of Boggy Creek and it got me interested. So that's why I wanted to stray away from that one, because that film's been talked about to death. And also I'm younger than like, it's funny because I'll be 43 this month, and I'm still usually the youngest guy in the room of Sasquatch by like 2 decades. You know what I mean? To this day, because I got started when I was 20.
We're the Chupacabra generation.
Yeah, exactly. But so for my generation, like that was the cultural touch point, right? Because it came out in the what was that, 87? So I was 5 when this came out. So that was the sort of first time seeing it. And so I would say we must celebrate the director's audacity at showing the Sasquatch in a lighthearted fashion. Now, it's not. I've got a laundry list of complaints about this movie and about the.
We'll save it for post-trial.
And about the depiction of the Sasquatch. But I do think like, it is nice that it's a bit of a different sort of vibe and a different aesthetic of something like that. And also, I do think that's one of the better suits from a technical perspective that you've seen on screen. It's a lot more involved. Obviously, Rick Baker is very talented, but I do think there are these historical nods in there that are pretty cool. Like, again, making these characters that are based on some of the real people that were initially involved, like the luminaries of that field, references throughout the film to them, like allusions to them, but also like the points where you see Wrightwood's books. Those are John Green's books. They've just been given different covers and titles, but when he opens them up and starts flipping through them, those are absolutely, copies of Green's books. So it was nice that they were like, oh, we'll give some nods at least to the fact that there really are people pursuing this question. Yeah, exactly. But at least that they're like, I guess in the same way that, not to compare the two by any means, but in the same way that Spielberg gave nods to like J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that this film, which is...
And Jurassic Park, those are based on real paleontologists too.
Yeah, let's just say that Harry and the Hendersons is right up there culturally with Jurassic Park and Close Encounters, right?
Wow, somebody said it.
Exactly.
It's in evidence.
We've all been thinking it. But I do think that makes it kind of cool from that perspective too, because all the other films, like no one else does that.
Did you have any other exhibits you wanted to bring forth in defense?
No, I'll save my criticism because all I have left are my criticisms.
we'll have plenty of time for that. Mr. Schlender, did you have a rebuttal against like how cool it was?
No, my look. I wanted to get out ahead of the suit early. The suit is a good suit, and like Matt said, it's not in the traditional mold of how Sasquatches are typically described. It is a unique take on it, but it's a good looking suit. I just wish there was a movie for it.
Both sides have rested their cases. The attorneys will now present their closing arguments. Mr. Schlender, you may begin.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of the day, Harry and the Hendersons is a series of half-baked ideas and recycled gags in overindulgent schmaltz held together by a pretty good suit. The narrative is not particularly strong. Despite what the defense would have you believe, there's not a lot of depth. And there's not a lot of thematic weight here. Instead, it plods along, and the audience realizes that they're not watching anything meaningful. So, when you go into that jury room, just think about, what the heck was I watching for 2 hours? Yeah, it was a good suit, but you see it right away. And it doesn't do anything. That's the thing, too. It doesn't do anything more than after the first time you see it. It's not even dynamic. So for those reasons, Harry and the Hendersons is guilty of being a bad movie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schlender. Mr. Pruitt, you may present your closing argument.
Again, I would say, place yourself in George's shoes. Like, have you had dreams and aspirations that society, the superego, the tyrannical father has tried to repress in you, tell you that you weren't good enough? Haven't you ever wanted to have an encounter with the unknown in a way that transforms you and that you might be able to transform it? Go on this hero's journey, unite your family together, save the wise old man from the abyss, integrate the shadow. Everybody wins. The unknown is forever changed. That's what this film is really about. And it can serve as a metaphor. Now, all these archetypal stories, they have to constantly be recapitulated for every new generation, for peoples in a certain time, in a certain place, so that these ideas will make sense to them. And so, if you've ever had to endure a road trip in the family station wagon in the 1980s, then this film will resonate deeply with you. And I would say, from the technical perspective, I think one of the strengths of this film is that you do get to see the whole suit right away, and you get to see it really well lit, under artificial lighting or out in broad daylight in these places that these other Sasquatch films never give you. You only see like brief glimpses of them at a distance or behind obstructions and vegetation or boulders or tree trunks or things like that. And so these filmmakers, they don't want to tease you. They don't want to tantalize you. They feel like you are worthy of the full experience from the go. They trust you. They're not going to dumb it down for you. They trust you enough to be able to handle this in its totality from jump. And for that, you can only thank them.
And thank you all. Members of the jury, Mr. Maynard Bangs, Mr. Big Ben Haslar, and Mr. The Abominable Ryan Luis Rodriguez. You have all heard the facts.
It's supposed to be scary.
I know, and I turned it sexy.
Yeah.
You have all heard the facts concerning this case. It's now up to you to determine if this film is guilty of being a bad movie. The bailiff will escort you to the deliberation room to render your verdict. Right this way. Do you suppose if Bigfoot walked into a bar, nobody would believe he was there?
Damn it, bailiff.
He gets it.
All right, interesting. I hope there's not going to be a test about this case, because I wasn't taking good enough notes. Brian, what are you thinking about the case?
This for me is the platonic ideal of an in-betweener. It really straddles the line of a 2.5 out of 5, to the point that there's stuff that I like about it, there's stuff that I really don't like about it. But in watching it, I was just struck by like how much I liked similar movies that were much better, like Sasquatch Sunset or Willow Creek, 2 excellent Sasquatch movies. And apparently I watched this back in 2020, according to Letterboxd, but I have no memory of it whatsoever. I just know the go away scene from that episode of 30 Rock.
Yes.
Where it's revealed that that everybody's been watching it on HBO, and even John Lithgow shows up in the elevator at the end. Is why are people watching my movie? That's what I know it for. And watching this is kind of like all I really learned was getting kicked in the nuts hurts, even if you're a Bigfoot.
You learned that.
You have like I'm glad we brought up E.T. before, because this is the same director of photography of E.T. So of course it looks good. We've mentioned the Rick Baker design, but something we didn't mention is that the guy underneath the suit, no small slouch, that's the Predator.
Oh, cool. That would have been a very different movie.
Big Bun.
So often in our courtroom, like we see the defender off balance because of what the prosecution brings. I like seeing the prosecutor being off balance by what the defense brought in. Like, oh, I really didn't have a case for the Freudian themes of Plan 9.
Schlenzo hung with the Jungian theme, by the way. The Freudians don't like it. You say that it's Jungian.
Jungian.
Yeah, you're right too. But screw him. But I thought Schlenzo hung on that topic pretty well, better than I would have.
So when I was watching it, I also kind of thought like Ryan, it was like a between worlds. It's a gentleman's five. It's like just as good as it is bad. The suit's good, but all he does is like sort of mug around. There's nothing of substance that I was holding on to. Apparently I missed a whole thing that I took a whole lot of notes about the themes I was missing.
He has disturbingly human teeth, by the way.
Hey, you don't. He's a missing link. He's between. You don't know.
Yeah, but can he floss that well? I mean, come on.
He can. He chooses not to.
Uses pine needles, perhaps.
But I did like the way that we brought in like that sort of the nods to the Bigfoot hunters of the field. I guess there is a lot more there than I didn't realize. Just because I thought it was a dumb family comedy, and family comedies are usually, they don't put a lot of thought into it. But Lithgow's good. Lithgow, he always shines in everything he's in. So when he was on the screen, or when the Sasquatch Harry was on the screen, I was okay. When everything else was on the screen, I was a little less enthused.
But he hits Harry in the face. He's such a meanie.
Oh, that was sad. I think Lithgow does sort of elevate the movie. This is a movie that I liked a lot as a kid, just because it had a Bigfoot in it. So I kind of always wanted to watch it, but in watching it here, you're absolutely right. Nothing happens. It's almost like they were afraid the suit would get damaged or dirty. Like it was so expensive to produce, they could never leave the house. And besides that, they can walk around a little in the backyard. And then they were finally able to get out to the woods. It was probably the last stuff they shot. But they were probably just terrified of ruining the suit.
We love movies that have a good suit, right? Like in this courtroom,
the
typically.
Suit is unimpeachable. I mean, I've got to say, the suit is just excellent. And
I wonder what it looks like in the TV show. Because you could never have something that complicated to reapply every day.
Right. Yeah. No, it definitely would have been quicker, or he would have done less, but like, I mean, if normal, this kind of fair movie, he actually would have been caught by the Yeti catcher. They would have had to go, bail him out and save him. He might have wandered into, like a woman's dressing room, maybe too family for that, but like nothing happens at all. But it is a damn good suit, and Lithgow's good. I don't know if that's enough to save it. I mean, the Jungian stuff is interesting, but I mean, the way all that symbolism works is everything is applicable to the sort of Jungian symbolism.
Every movie's a good movie.
Well, I just don't know that this movie is actually painted intentionally with any of that symbolism, and I don't think that got proven to me either.
Maybe you just don't understand it.
Who wants to lock in first? Ryan?
I'll look in. This is because it's straight down the middle. I gotta look at the cases provided. The fact that the prosecution mentioned several times how they would prosecute this movie, or did I say prosecution? Defense constantly talked about how they would prosecute the movie. Never do that. Never ever do that.
They didn't go into detail. Really.
I'm now voting guilty.
Oh, you don't know how good his case would have been.
He's harsh. Yeah, he might have been wrong.
I'm harsh but fair.
I got swept away with the self-actualization and proto-morality of it all. There's a whole movie beneath the surface that we didn't know, and just the fact that the defense was willing to go that far to the mat for it. I can't give that a guilty. So not guilty from me.
Okay. I was impressed by the defense's ability to draw on his vast knowledge of Jungian symbolism, possibly from college. But I faked a lot of those college essays too. And I don't know that that the movie was really painted with that. And at the end of the day, all that means is this is about George's journey. And I do agree with that. This is more about George's journey than Harry's. George is the one who changes, but he changes on a dime. And I think the word that the prosecution used was unearned. Like the ending, all the sentimental, it's unearned. You know, they don't spend any time with Harry. When are they going to bond? And when he does, he mostly destroys their floor like 4 times. So wonderful suit. Obviously, Rick Baker's great, but there's other movies to watch his work in. And they just do too little in this. It's just too dull. So I've got to go guilty. So we should get out there and tell that very handsome judge.
I think he is handsome, yeah. Mr. Foreman, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor. In the case of the people versus Harry and the Hendersons, we find the defendant guilty of being a bad movie.
The verdict is so rendered. Harry and the Hendersons is sentenced to 10 years hard time in the woods while we have to live with John Lithgow looking very disappointed at us. Court is adjourned.
Ooh, an Oscars mention. Ooh, that's gonna be remembered 3 weeks from now. This is Wavy Waverson, man, reporting to you live from outside the Reels of Justice, or should I say, award winner Wavy Waverson. I don't remember what that was actually for, but it's an honor being nominated, man. And here comes Matt Pruitt, the most copacetic, righteous dude around. How do you feel about today's verdict?
I can live with it. I don't blame him.
Groovy, you're that predictable. And here comes our official podcast Sasquatch, Dylan J. Schlender. Excuse me, can we get a word on how you feel about today's verdict as if it matters?
Oh, Wavy, and congratulations. I actually voted for you, so very happy to see you won that award.
Thank you very much, man.
Yeah, and look, I totally understand where this verdict came from. I'm with the jury. This is very much a 50-50 movie for me, you know, flip a coin, and, you know, it just landed on heads today. So thank you guys, and have a good one.
That's all we have from the courthouse today. Let's go back to the studio for post-trial analysis, because I'm off to buy some cheap brown acid. Remember, kids, stay in school and only buy drugs you can afford. I speak from experience. Wavy out.
Prize money with that award, I guess.
I hope things turn around for Wavy one day soon.
Well, I mean, I think we pay them well enough because Grumbly came back for a paycheck to buy drugs.
So,
but Matt, that probably makes no sense.
What do you hate about the movie?
Lay it on us.
Well, I hadn't seen it in like forever. And so when Dylan reached out, I was like, oh, let's do something different than The Legend of Boggy Creek. So I rewatched it and I was like, oh, man. I mean, from the get-go, I took some notes. Like, first of all, after they hit the thing, I was like, man, Lithgow's like muzzle sweeping his whole family with that rifle multiple times.
Yes, I noticed that too. I cringed so hard. Oh, I
think it's intentional.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe that's an indicator of like his shadow, right? Like maybe he's got some dark repressed motivations. And no, like I don't want to brag about college, but I do have 2 semesters of community college under my belt.
I knew it.
None of it touched on Jung. I only discovered Jung about 6 years ago. And so when I was trying to dig into this movie, I was like, God, how could I save this? And so I tried to borrow a bit to try to twist it into something much more meaningful than it actually is. But yeah, I mean, obviously there's a, like we talked about, a sort of disparity between the suit design and what witnesses describe, but it is a cool suit. I mean, it is, I do.
So how is it different? What do people think? He's bulkier.
Well, it's certainly like mass wise, people describe a much smaller head size to overall body proportions and much wider shoulders, but it's specifically like proportionately longer arms than a human would have, which is
Didn't you bring this shit?
And
Shinzo?
like a flatter head? Am I incorrect in that?
well, it really depends because a lot of apes have a feature called the sagittal crest, which is a ridge of bone atop the skull that chewing muscles attached to, like jaw muscles, etc. That and zygomatic arches, and that's a feature of size. And so, in certain ape species, it's more prominent in males because all apes are sexually dimorphic, meaning that the males are of larger average size than the females. But even females that achieve a certain size will attain a sagittal crest. And so, depending on when you really break down eyewitness accounts or claims, let's say, because we don't know if there's something there to be genuinely witnessed or not. But the claims basically, like the larger the individuals, the more they describe what often gets referred to as like a peaked head. Something that would suggest the presence of a sagittal crest. Whereas in juveniles or smaller individuals or even like smaller females, it can be more rounded or like dome-like. So they kind of incorporated that feature there in hairy, but more than anything, what people describe very consistently are disproportionately long arms. Like if you were to compare their body plan to a human's, the arms are much longer. And again, that's the case with all the great apes, but specifically, there's a fossil ape that existed in Asia, a lineage.
Gigantopithecus?
Yeah, so the precursor to that was called Indopithecus, and they lived in Western Asia. The oldest examples are about 8.6 million years old. And so those were in like the Potwar Plateau of Pakistan and the Sawalik Hills of India. And then there's this younger form, undoubtedly related, but that's the genus they call Gigantopithecus. And those are about 2+ million years old until the youngest fossils are roughly 80 to 100,000 years old. And they had a much wider span. They were in China, Vietnam, Thailand, all the way down into Indonesia. And so this lineage of apes, we know they shared a common ancestor with orangutans. They diverged from a common ancestor about 10 to 12 million years ago, Gigantopithecus and the orangutan. And all those apes are descended from a lineage of apes that are brachiators, meaning that they hang from their arms, from limbs. So they climb trees in the way that other apes do, but rather than like walking on limbs vertically upright, like African apes did, which is probably what gave rise to bipedalism in our species, is that as those apes came out of the trees and onto the ground, they were already sort of built to walk on two legs. Whereas the Asian ape lineage, they were suspensory, so they hung vertically from branches and moved along. And that's why you see very long arms in the Asian apes, like orangs and gibbons.
And some of them rode unicycles. The fossil record is sketchy.
It's very sketchy.
Matt, it sounds like you know a lot about Sasquatch. It's almost like you wrote a book about it.
I did. After like 20 plus years of study, I finally took the time to try to synthesize I was aiming to write, the single most comprehensive work that exists, because for years people would always ask like, oh, well, what should I read? And the answer is truly like, well, you should read these 5 books or at best these 10 books. And so I thought, well, maybe I could set out to write, like, if you only ever read a single book on the subject, this one would give you as thorough an education as possible. And then if you wanted to
title.
Yeah. So that if you wanted to do deeper dives, there's other books that go deeper into certain elements. But this one I think is the most comprehensive overview, and it's called The Phenomenal Sasquatch: Seeking the Natural Origins of a Cultural Icon.
And if I could just tell you, because I love researching Sasquatch, and mission accomplished, my friend, because I am the guy who read those 10 other books. And I will tell people, if you want to read one book that gives you the broadest understanding of Sasquatch as a phenomenon too, which I think is a very important distinction you make, is 100% your book. I love the way you structure it, because you start off very broad. You start talking about, what does it mean? What is the phenomenal Sasquatch? What do I mean by that? Then you zoom in on all the evidence, everything we know about Sasquatch and the historical record and what we're doing today. And then you broaden it back out. I mean, it's incredibly well structured. And until we actually find a living Sasquatch, this is going to be the definitive book on the subject. But once we find a real one, then you can add to it, like, version 2. So
I greatly appreciate it. That's very kind. Yeah. I appreciate that a lot. And that's
100% true.
That's the thing, is like we don't know that these things exist. Either there's an animal species that exists that fits the description that people claim and that has feet that are shaped like the footprints attributed to them, or in lieu of that, I think it can only be a psychological phenomenon. I don't think that it's something supernatural, metaphysical, extraterrestrial, all these much more complicated and
let's not throw out some of that extraterrestrial stuff yet. Let's not.
So that's a good point. There's no woo-woo explanation in your book, and that turns a lot of people off from even getting interested in the hobby, right? Because that's getting more and more popular out there in the Bigfoot sphere, because there's not a lot of new stuff to talk about. So people say, well, what if they're actually,
too.
Yeah, it's like, what if they're actually like descendant of Nephilim? Well, what if they're actually like shadow stepping? And it's like, no, what if it's just possible that at some point there's a big ape that no one's discovered because not a lot of people with the right training have been looking? And I think that's another great point you bring up in your book. It's like everyone always says, oh, well, why haven't we seen one? Why haven't we seen one? Well, in theory, maybe we've seen a ton of them, right? We just don't have a very, very good record of it. Yeah. Or we just haven't had the right people out there.
I honestly think, and again, I don't write the rules to your point, like science, academia, the government, et cetera. But typically speaking, it's always taken a holotype, a type specimen, a representative of the species in order to have that thing fully recognized. Mm-hmm. And that's been a big debate, which, I should have brought this up in the trial there, because that's a debate that's sort of reflected to some degree in that film, is this idea of like, well, if they exist, is it ethical to try to harvest, to dispatch a living individual and harvest a specimen in order to not only prove that they exist, but to understand like, okay, well, what are their habitat requirements? And if we identify that, can we protect that habitat to ensure their continued survival, et cetera? And so, it ends up being a very emotional argument for people in that they think like, well, it's sad and it's ugly to think about dispatching a living individual. And then the other flip side is like, well, it could be absolutely necessary. And unfortunately, the reality is like both those arguments are absolutely true. It is sad. It is ugly. It is probably necessary. And the reason I say that is that for these many years, a lot of the academics that I've talked to who show an interest, their position is always like, well, we'll wait and see until something really compelling comes in, and then we'll take action. And in every one of those instances, it's been like, well, what action would be taken? And it almost always results in like, well, some institution would mount an effort to go collect one. Just because if they do exist, they must be rare and have very large home ranges. And like other apes, they probably live long lives, anywhere from 50 to 60 years in the wild. And so if you imagine an animal with a home range of like 70 to 100 square miles that can live 50 to 60 years, like pick any wild place that you're familiar with. Let's say it's even the size of a county. Like, what are the odds that one of those things is going to die in that area within the next decade? So good luck finding the remains of a naturally deceased individual. Now, I would like to think that we're at a point with genetics that you could ostensibly either recover a sample, or maybe with the way that eDNA, environmental DNA, is coming along, you might be able to identify novel species via that. Although, I don't have as much hope for that as I do from something that's more like a discrete sample. Are you guys familiar with environmental DNA?
So this would be like when they find a purported Bigfoot nesting ground or something and pulling the information from there?
Well, yeah, essentially you can sample the environment, whatever that environment is, whether it's soil or water, or in some instances, air. They can even vacuum essentially like volumes, like cubic feet of air, and then whatever DNA is present there. But what a lot of people don't realize is that relies on having a discrete sample or a sequenced genome first. So a good example would be like, if these things are related to the orangutan, if they're Gigantopithecus, for example, they would be as related to us as is the orangutan. So that would be roughly 97% of our DNA would be shared. Now, if they did come from some African lineage, like post the split with the common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees, like, gorillas are prior to that split. And so we share about 98% of our DNA with them. And then chimpanzees are our closest living relatives. We share nearly 99%. So if you're sampling the environment and you're using certain primers to, detect the presence of something like bears, wolves, ungulates like elk or deer or whatever, what primers are you going to use for a Sasquatch? Well, you'd either use one of the known apes or humans. And so you would probably find like an overwhelming amount of homology. You would have to be able to have enough genetic material to separate from everything else in that environment, to sequence the genome of just that species in order to detect that small, like 3 to 2 to 1% difference between us and them. And so that's kind of the history of, when you look at the history of purported Sasquatch samples, there have been many that have been collected. I say many, between like a dozen and 2 dozen. And of those, a handful have been submitted for genetic testing. They're usually given these really cursory overviews, and they're using very often human primers. And so it's the case time and time again. Like hair is a good example. Hair has anatomy. Hair is a physical structure. And so there are a number of hair samples. And I think in my book, I have like the largest repository of the descriptions of all of the hair samples that have been attributed to Sasquatches. They all share features morphologically, anatomically, that make them unique. They do share characteristics with the other apes, but they're markedly not attributable to humans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, etc. So the consensus is, well, this is some sort of primate hair, but it doesn't match any of the known primates. But of those that have been subjected to genetic testing, they get this cursory view and they go, oh, well, it's a positive match for a human. And so there's always this disparity between the people who are looking at it under a microscope and studying the structure of the hair, saying this is absolutely not human, and the geneticist saying like, well, it's such a close match for human, it has to be human. And in cases,
somebody doesn't shampoo enough.
Yeah, in some cases, like when it's demonstrably, non-human hair, they'll say, well, we don't know what it is, but whatever it was mishandled by the humans that collected it. Therefore, someone sneezed on it. Or I kind of thought about it. Do you guys remember the scene in the movie where LaFleur picks up the Sasquatch hair and then he licks it for some reason? I was like, yeah, that's
a perfectly normal thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, he must have a lot of experience with what they taste like. You know what I mean? So
well,
David, suck it.
How this stuff is collected is of concern. And again, it is something you bring up in your book. I just want everyone out there to appreciate how thorough Matt's book is going in to all this stuff. I mean, it's
Matt, if you need a blurb for your book, Schlenzo has been often blurbed.
That's true.
I appreciate that. And I'm sorry for the long-winded answer. It's just
I love it, dude. I'm here for it.
Yeah, people had better sign up for it if they came to this episode, right?
It's for those reasons that my concern would be that nothing less than like either a diagnostic portion of an animal, like a hand, a foot, a skull, a jaw, teeth, anything less than that will still be disputed. And I even think, like, let's say that someone did get a specimen. I think the resistance, because the taboo has been so deeply set for so long, the stigma, that whatever accommodations have to be made to accept that new discovery will be as minimal as possible. So you can imagine, like, if someone did find a dead one or hit one with a truck or a station wagon or a hunter shot one or something in the Olympic Mountains of Washington, people think like, oh, that would prove that they exist in North America. Like, no, I highly doubt it. I think what would happen is, the first talking heads would say, well, it appears that these things did get here from Asia, and seems like a few of them clung on to existence in the Olympic Mountains, but there's no reason to think that they're in the Cascades and the Rockies and the Appalachians. And it will still be this long process. Now, what you could do, if you did have something like a tooth or a single bone from which you could sequence a full genome, after that point, you could use eDNA to detect the presence of other populations in other parts of the continent. But until then, we've always seen this cycle, and I've seen it myself dealing with professionals over the years, academics and professional scientists, in that you have something that you think is compelling. But again, I'm a lay person. Like, I'm a former professional guitar player with 2 semesters of community college, so I can't evaluate, I can't analyze these things. And so I try to network with these people. And so I'll have something in hand, and the conversation's always like, well, hey, can I get you to take a look at this? Like, sure. What do you got? Oh, well, it might be evidence of Sasquatch. Oh, well, Sasquatches don't exist. Oh, why do you say that? Oh, well, there's no evidence. Well, what would change your mind? Oh, I'd need to see some evidence. Well, when you take a look at this, oh, that can't be evidence because they don't exist. Well, what would change your mind? Oh, I'd need to see evidence. So it's this like perpetual, this perpetual frustration there. So
sort of a catch-22.
I do think, unfortunately, now I would not be the LaFleur character. Like I don't carry a rifle in the field. Like I'm not trying to collect a specimen, as per the scientific nomenclature. But I do think that that's ultimately, even if we got clear video and photographs that were coupled with a line of hyper clear tracks,
Photos is nothing
and
anymore.
DNA. I think even if you brought a mountain of everything, cumulatively, an institution would say, well, now we have enough basis to launch an effort to collect one. So I think all roads kind of lead to that point.
All right, let's get out there and get them. Give us the book title one more time.
The Phenomenal Sasquatch. It's available on Amazon. I sold through there, or my good friend and podcast co-host Cliff Barrickman sells them through his website at the North American Bigfoot Center. That's the only place you can get like autographed copies.
Shout out to Cliff.
Indeed.
Now, we always ask from our guests for recommendations of movies you think people should see. So what is a movie you think people should see?
You know what? There is one cryptozoological movie that I've seen that I was like, that's actually a good film. And it's not, it's centered around a cryptozoological pursuit, but it's not a crypto creature movie. But have you guys ever seen The Hunter with Willem Dafoe?
Yes, actually. Very good movie.
I really like that film.
Yeah.
And so for folks who are into like the potential survival of animals that were thought to be extinct and good flicks, I think that's a great one.
Yeah, because he's going after a Tasmanian tiger in that one, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is good. The only thing I didn't like about it is like there was like a hunter hunting him, like keeping tabs on him. Like, why not just send that hunter to kill the Tasmanian tiger? But regardless,
Spoiler alert.
Oh,
there's the supervising hunter, Schlenzo. What's your recommendation?
Everything's a spoiler. Well, okay, so I had a stack of recommendations, and like I mentioned, since the beekeepers got taken away from me, I had to watch something really quick. And thank God Liam Neeson makes so many hackers, and I'm able to recommend Run All Night from 2015. And what's neat about this one is it's actually pretty slick and highly produced. Like there's a lot of dynamic action. There's like car chases, helicopters, and Ed Harris.
Wow.
So basically it follows the Liam Neeson formula. He's an alcoholic ex-hitman, who's getting too old for this. His son accidentally gets in trouble with his old boss, played by Ed Harris. And so now these two former friends have to go to war because of the mistakes their sons made. And again, it's not doing anything different. It's fun. It's great. Liam Neeson gets into a lot of hand-to-hand combat for an old guy in this one. He even fights Common, the rapper turned actor there. He's bald. He's in lots of movies nowadays. And again, if right down the middle, Liam Neeson action movie. Not a lot to complain about. It was on Tubi, but I don't think it's on Tubi anymore. So I think you got to go on
for Tubi.
I know. So I think you got to go to like Paramount Plus now, and I don't recommend that. So this may be one you never see. I'm sorry.
You can watch all of Star Trek while you're at it.
Oh, double your pain. Big Ben, what have you got?
My friends, in 1987, while we were watching a family make friends with something that looks kind of like Bigfoot, debatably, do you know what supernatural chicanery our friends in China were enjoying? A tax collector falling in love with a ghost who must cause trouble to the poor man because her bones are buried beneath a giant evil tree. We just don't get stories like that over here anymore, or at all. I speak, of course, of A Chinese Ghost Story, or as the Chinese title is translated, The Ethereal Spirit of Beauty. Many people in my life question. It's a little simpler that way. Many people in my life question me as to why I'm often drawn to Asian art, and I think a lot of it has to do with just how exotic and different it all feels from the Western mindset. There's a lot I can get on board with, certainly, but the atmospheric tales of supernatural beasts that are both cautionary and beautiful, I absolutely can. The vibes, that feeling you get when you're watching a brave person in a dark forest illuminated by a candle and a paper lamp while pursued by a Taoist swordsman and a robed beauty floating above them while a tree is waiting to strangle them all like Mr. Willow sans Tom Bombadillo. Sign me up. There's also kind of an Evil Dead vibe I get with the darkness and the special and the practical effects, but this film also doesn't take itself too seriously. Just seriously enough, but very aware what its subject matter is. No nudity, but very sensual, so I don't know if it'll fit into the Schlender's horror boxes for kids category, but maybe give it a go if you want something different.
I'll check out the Parents Guide.
Sure.
Yep, you got follow that up. Always got to make sure. You never know. They'll sneak in there. Ryan, what have you got?
These days, when you hear the word shin in conversation, it refers to Godzilla. But my truck commendation this week is a different kind of shin. 2022's Shin Ultraman.
Yes!
It retains the serio-comic satire of unbreakable bureaucracy, but in a minor key. Anyway, I didn't grow up with the character, so I was frequently lost, but it's full of eccentric camera angles and some solid, mostly practical kaiju battles. It not only made me want someone to continue the franchise, it inspired me to go back and watch the original series at my leisure of choice. Shin Ultraman is currently streaming on Hoopla, the bastard stepson of Canopy. Support your local library. Hoopla! Hoopla!
As someone who did grow up with Ultraman and saw it in theaters, even I had a hard time following it because it's not really one storyline. They took like 5 or 6 different episodes and made it into one movie. So like plot lines just
We only
take
got one
about
shot. We got to
10
get all
minutes
our
and then another monster shows up over and over. But the effects are pretty great. Now, there's just not enough Yeti movies. And even less good ones, as I think we've mentioned, as you know, a lot of them have suits that are even worse than Patterson Gimlin, and that's a compliment. That suit was really good. Wink, wink. I'm gonna recommend one from the way back machine from Hammer Studios. It's The Abominable Snowman from 1957. The movie is from 1957, not the snowman. He's from the Himalayas. It follows an expedition to the aforementioned mountain range in pursuit of the fabled creature, but not all of the party's members have ambitions grounded in science. Starring Forrest Tucker and the unparalleled Peter Cushing, that's enough to justify seeing it right there. This casts the creature in a relatively sympathetic light, which might be surprising for the time period, but the film is able to balance it out by also making them telepathic. Although that has a touch of some modern theories, because now others are beginning to believe the Sasquatch may have some supernatural abilities. You know this, Ben. Teleportation,
Not true. Not
shadow
true.
stepping, ancient astronaut theorists
Oh,
suggest...
no.
The film also hesitates to ever show you the monster, except cast in shadow or obscured by heavy snowstorms. But it actually contributes to the creature's mystique and elusiveness as much as it keeps the budget low. I mean, yes, it also keeps the budget low, but the point is they make it work. And you get to see a Sherpa, like, kind of run all the way down a mountainside in terror in, like, just mere seconds. And that's worth the price of admission. And that price will probably be pretty low because somebody uploaded it to YouTube. And of course, whether the film chooses to make man the real monster is something I'll ultimately let you discover for yourself.
Oh, boo.
You know he is. Man is always the real monster.
I know.
Right? Matt, is man the real monster?
Undoubtedly.
Yeah,
Sometimes.
there we have it.
Sometimes.
And with that, we are all at a show.
Undoubtedly sometimes.
But we want to thank our guest, Matt Pruitt, for joining us. Thank you so much, Matt.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
We've learned a little bit about ourselves, a lot about Bigfoot, and some about the ego consciousness, I think. And we're going to have you back as the Reels of Justice keep turning.
Count it.
Go away! We don't want you here! Oh.
Please follow us on Twitter at Reels of Justice, Instagram Reels of Justice, and Facebook.com/Reels of Justice.